Hey everybody, welcome back to Black Lotus, where we talk about all things strange and unusual. And today, speaking of unusual, we're going to be talking about vampires, real life vampires, and how the vampire culture has affected our society. But first, before we get into this, I want to thank you for watching and also remind you that we have a group over at Facebook called the Black Lotus Discussion Group, and we talk about all things that are related to what we talk about here, the topics we talk about here on Black Lotus. And if you want to be a member of a really good paranormal group, this is the one to join, most definitely. We don't have trolls there. Everybody gets along really well. We have experts in the paranormal and in ufology and cryptids. And so if you're into the stuff we talk about, definitely check us out over there. Also, I want to briefly mention, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as follow us over at Anchor. Our podcast over there, and I will drop links for that in the description below. But anyway, so let's get into this today, man. I think the first thing I want to talk about here is that I find it interesting that until Bram Stoker's Dracula came out, vampires were just hideous ghouls.
Right.
He was the first one to romanticize the whole thing. Insofar as that, I mean, yeah, he drank blood, but you still wanted to have him around at parties. So I don't know. Women adored him, and men wanted to be like him. And I think that is a precursor to what happened later on in the century with Anne Rice. She brought the whole romanticism to life. I mean, you and I both read the Vampire Chronicles, and I gotta say, these vampires seemed real. I mean, as real as you could get. It's like she was writing their autobiography.
Yeah, she did a great job at bringing the characters to life.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, she's a great writer anyway. I mean, even the way she described old New Orleans, she does a lot of great research in her books. And so, yeah, I really dig Anne Rice. So she made it popular during the late 70s and early 80s. And because she brought it to life so much, people started to really identify with vampires, and they wanted to be vampires. I remember back then, everybody wanted to dress in black and be a vampire.
Right.
And that brought forth the whole goth scene. Really.
Right. I was interested to read, though, on some of the research I did in this, there's really only about 35% of vampires are goth.
Right.
So it might have been a predecessor to it, but nowadays the real modern day vampire is not a goth, fashionable type vampire.
Yeah. Back then they were, though, for the most part. But you're right. The modern day person who identifies as a vampire, they're still real people, but I mean, they're not the walking undead, that kind of thing. But yeah, they a lot of them don't dress that way.
What I found interesting is that you say, that they call themselves vampires. It's like calling yourself any other type of thing, like labeling yourself. A vampire is not what we would think as a vampire anymore nowadays. They don't go around biting people in the neck and killing people.
Well, right. And yeah, we'll get into that most definitely when we get into the real life versions of vampires. But going back to the 80s again, I wanted to mention some of the influences. And that was, I mean, the music influences.
Movies.
Movies, you had Bauhaus and you had The Cure, and granted these were goth groups, but it really appealed to the shall I say, kids back then,
right.
And everybody was running around in black and painting their faces to look, vampiric, and but then another big influence that happened was that role-playing game, Vampire the Masquerade.
That was in the 90s?
That was in, I want to say it started in late, or maybe mid 80s, and it went into the 90s. Yeah, and
Big influence.
a huge influence. I mean, and the thing is that it was a role playing game like Dungeons and Dragons,
Right.
but it eventually outsold Dungeons and Dragons, and it was a different type of role playing game. I mean, it was still pretty much played the same way, but it was all about developing a clan and that kind of thing. A clan of other vampires and
Right.
that sort of thing. But it further changed later on when LARPing became kind of a thing.
Right.
The live action role playing, where people would go out and to a park or a hall or something, and they would act out their characters, and they would dress up. I mean, and they had everything, from the typical uh, romanticized vampire to like the old Nosferatu kind of
Right.
ugly looking, rat looking thing. But it was a different type of role playing, live action role playing game than you would find through like D&D, because D&D you would have these foam swords, and you would have to hit your opponent and just yell out 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9, and depending on how many hit points they had.
Right.
But with this, it was a different situation. They didn't go around biting people. It was more of a drama kind of thing.
It's more about the story.
Yeah, it was more, and I think that is why it started to outsell Dungeons and Dragons, is because it was all about the story and all about the drama. But the thing is that this influenced the vampire culture so much so that people started dressing like this in real life.
Right.
And they started to identify themselves as vampires. Now, let's get into the whole real vampire thing.
Yeah, and actually, the real vampires, a lot of them don't come out of the coffin, as they say, and tell people in their normal life because they're afraid of the ridicule they'll
Oh,
get.
sure, I would imagine so. I mean, you can't go around telling people that you work with that you
I'm a vampire and I go drink blood.
drink blood, But I mean, the people that claim to be vampires, that's a hell of a thing to say. I don't think they claim to be vampires. They are vampires. I mean, it's kind of like when people say, well, she claims to be a psychic. That bugs me, because I'm of the personal belief that people are psychic. You don't claim to be a psychic. It sounds like it's like you're
Well, in
making
their
this
eyes,
up.
they are vampires.
You're right, exactly. Excuse me. But this culture incorporates thousands of people worldwide.
Right.
And
I was surprising at how many sites there are out there for communities for vampires.
yeah, and I think that that's great, especially when you have to. Most people feel that they have to hide this. It's good to be able to have the resources available. And for instance, there's Voices of the Vampire Community, commonly known as VVC. And I'll drop a link to that in the description as well. And there's another big one out there. Now, there are a lot of sites like this, but these two are probably the most popular. So it's the VVC, and there's also the Atlanta Vampire Alliance, AVA. And like I said, I'll drop links for both of those down.
The other one I found that I thought was very interesting was vampirewebsite.net.
Okay.
They had a very, very good website, and they talk about everything from vampire-friendly bars and clubs to finding donors. It's like most of them. They'll answer any of the questions you could possibly even think of about real vampires.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and but the thing about this is that you mentioned the biting. There's no biting in these communities. Right. It's mainly what they do, and it's kind of a treat for them. They don't do this on a daily basis, and they don't feel that they need to have it to survive. But usually, what happens is the vampire will make a small scalpel incision, and either feed from the source there, or more commonly, I guess, is that they would have medically trained professional actually draw the blood
Right.
from the donor. And but yeah, I mean the donors are
voluntary.
They're always voluntary. I mean, in fact, from what I understand, there's actually paperwork involved.
Right, and it's not only that, you're also having to be tested for several diseases.
Right, because there's a lot of bloodborne illness out there.
Actually, drinking blood for a human drinking blood is not good for a human. There's a lot of iron in blood, and your body has problems processing that iron. So when you drink, if you drink too much blood, you actually will make yourself sick.
Right, and so that's why I say it's kind of a special treat. It's usually done maybe once a week, or some people even do it like once a month, but they make a ritual out of the whole thing. But there is a thing out there, and it's called hematomania. And basically, what that is, it's the craving to drink blood.
Right.
And people have found, they're not necessarily born with this thing, but increasingly over their life, and it starts by eating very rare steaks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was reading about one woman who they call it the awakening when you figure out you're a vampire. And she said she figured it out when she got up one night and ate a whole half pound of hamburger raw and bloody.
Yeah. Which again probably isn't very good for you, considering the diseases out there. But yeah, nobody knows what causes this. It causes this to happen with some people. It doesn't happen to all vampires, but it does happen to some. And but they claim that this mania. They describe it as an intense thirst, and they say that sometimes drinking animal blood curbs it, but they also say nothing's like human blood.
Right.
But
one of the other things I found interesting on that site, Voices of the Vampire Community, was their memberships. There's only a 38.7% male and 57.2% female.
That doesn't really surprise me that much, and I'll tell you why. And it's because things like the Vampire Chronicles, and even Dracula, but even the movies that have been around since the 80s, like Lost Boys and all that. I mean, there was a strong feminine draw to that, because I mean, you've got like Lestat and Louis and Armand, and then you've got people like, I don't remember his name in the movie, but like Kiefer Sutherland, and women just went nuts for these people. David, no, that wasn't David. David was the one they turned into a vampire.
That was Michael.
Oh, you're right. It was David. You're right. No, but great movie.
Yeah.
One of the best ones out there, I think.
I thought it was interesting too that 4% were transgender.
Is that right?
Of their group.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting. So that must be like double prejudiceness that they have to worry about.
All right. Yeah, I would imagine so. But I did read that the whole idea of these real life vampires, it transcends borders between genders and race and and class. So you could be the working class hero, but some of these like LARPing events, you kind of get out of your skin for a while,
right.
And so you're able to do that. But here's something I wanted to bring up. We were talking about Vampire the Masquerade. There was a guy back in the 80s who was into this big time, and he ended up killing 2 people in Florida. And and I guess it wasn't in the 80s, it was in the early 90s, but in 1998, the guy's name was Rod Farrell, and he pleaded guilty to the double slaying of this couple from Eustis, Florida, and he ended up going on to the death row, and he was the youngest person to ever go on to death row. But he was later his penalty was reduced to just life in prison. He's still alive today. But yeah, I mean, it just goes to show you that no matter whatever you're into, I mean, people can take it to the extreme, and I think that cases like that are probably why a lot of modern day real life vampires don't want to come out of the coffin.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
can you imagine having to tell people, especially people that you have to tell, people like your doctor? He has to know what you're doing.
And I would imagine it's really hard to find a sympathetic ear in the medical community for this.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, like we have that friend of ours, Marlena, who is transgender. And she had to find a doctor that was sympathetic to that sort of thing. So I can only imagine how difficult it is, you know, to find a doctor when you go, oh, by the way, I drink blood.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's got to be tough, you know, because I'm sure every doctor, most doctors anyway, would go, you're out of your mind and that's extremely dangerous and you shouldn't do that. You know?
Right.
So,
Because it is. It's very dangerous.
it is. It is.
Very risky. One of the things I found was interesting too when I was looking into this was that an actual professor from the University of Florida, of Central Florida, excuse me, in 2006 figured out that mathematically it's impossible for vampires to exist based on geometric progression, which basically he said, say in January 1st of 1600, the first vampire appeared and bit somebody once a month, and every time he bit somebody, that person turned into a vampire. Then by 2.5 years, everybody in the world will be vampires.
Well, yeah, but that goes upon that theory that if a vampire bites you, you automatically become a vampire. And I think that that whole theory, because of that idea, has been updated, and it was updated actually by Anne Rice. Insofar as you had to bite the vampire had to feed you its blood after it bit you. You know, and so, yeah, because that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
You know, I mean, it would be kind of like the zombie outbreak. You know, as soon as
Eventually,
the
there's
zombie
going to
bite
be
you.
no more.
Right. I mean, the zombies would take over the world in a matter of a week or two. You know, so yeah, I mean, it doesn't really jive, but yeah.
But yeah, that's the other thing too, is they have to worry about being psychologically inept, or be called psychologically inept, put into a mental hospital or something.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You know, willing to do harm to yourself and others. You know, so I mean, but that's why the donors have to fill out all this paperwork. It's not just about being clean. It's also about your psyche and if you're of sound mind, I think so. But
Yeah, I would love to talk to somebody who's a vampire and get their side of the story.
well, and I have a friend of mine on Facebook who I'm mutual friends with her through Laura Lee Potvin, who we've had on the show, and she's the one who experiences terrifying encounters with a demon at her house. But anyway, the person I know is Seraphine Hurley, and she identifies as a vampire, I guess. Now, I don't know what sort of vampire she identifies as, if she drinks blood or if she's like a psychic vampire or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But she's a really nice woman,
A psychic vampire, for those who don't know, is somebody who feeds off of energy.
Right. Yeah. But
I'm sure if you've been on this channel, you know what we're talking about. But just to make sure.
But yeah, but and like I said, I mean, one of the reasons there's no biting involved, I guess, is because there's too many arteries in the neck
that you can kill somebody easily.
Yeah, easy, I would imagine. Be like slicing their neck open. But and plus it's not very sanitary, I would imagine. Not unless you rubbed it out with alcohol and that kind of stuff.
Still, your germs on their neck is probably not sanitary either.
Yeah. So the ones that do the small little inch slice,
It's usually on a fatty part of the body.
Yeah, and I can't imagine. I mean, there's so many germs in the human mouth. Interchanging with your blood, that's probably not a good idea. I think if I were to do it, I would do it through a medical professional. That would be willing to draw the blood from my donor. Can
you imagine trying to find one of those? Well, I guess that's what the websites are for.
Yeah. See, and that's just it. And that's just it. They are helpful websites if you're into this thing, and so if you are, definitely check out these websites if you haven't already, because I think they're very helpful. They set you up with donors, they set you up with medical professionals, and
they say you usually find out during your adolescent years.
Yeah.
When you're going through puberty and stuff.
Yeah.
I guess it's too late for me to be a vampire.
Well, anyway, so let's get out of here, man.
Sounds good.
All right. Until next time, folks, keep thinking and question everything.